Hey everybody, Ryan here at Plague Scythe Studios. Welcome back to another Boss Katana themed video, this time in a blind shootout. You know how it goes around here. A new amplifier, at least new to me, means a new blind shootout, as I just have to compare the crunchy and higher gain modes of all the things I have to some of the industry standards and some of the modeling tech as well as tube tech that I have in this room. And I actually wasn't planning on doing this one, so appreciate the commenter who suggested this particular concept, that was kind of obvious in hindsight. But I think the reason it didn't really dawn on me initially is that there are a number of amplifier modes on here to the point that it's kind of hard to say, well, the Katana is trying to do these 2 or 3 channels. Let's compare that to those 2 or 3 amplifiers because there's quite a few on board. So I ultimately decided to limit the scope of this video to 6 of the onboard amplifier modes, which are really 3 different modes in the 2 variations. That is crunch, lead, and brown, all kind of going for somewhere in between supercharged Marshall Plexi all the way up to contemporary 5153 style amplifier tone. So we're going to be looking at each one of those modes individually. I'm not exactly that interested in the cleaner modes because, as we've kind of looked at before on this channel, you can kind of emulate clean stuff almost with transistors or free VSTs to the point that it's just not the selling point for this kind of amplifier to me. So looking at this through at least a higher gain biased perspective will hopefully kind of uncover the strengths and weaknesses of Boss's, what is really their kind of last gen modeling tech at this point. And we'll be able to determine, is it worth having? Is it good enough to substitute something that you would keep at home and be able to still get decent tones playing out? Is this the all-in-one recording rig for you? Or are you better off learning your way around a digital audio workstation a little better and exploring the immense world of free VST plugins? Let's find out. So if you've seen one of these shootouts before, you probably know how this goes, so I'll just briefly recap for those that do not. We're going to isolate as many variables as possible here. I'm not going to use any type of drive pedals, and I'm not even going to use real outboard cabinets just to eliminate any potential for microphone sagging or some other noise bleeding through. We'll stick to impulse responses exclusively. We'll be using kind of a V30 blend between a Mesa and Friedman style cabinet from ML Sound Labs, and that will also limit the amount of power amp influence that will be had on this tone, though there will certainly be power amps involved from the different gear that at least have them on board, whether it be solid state tube or otherwise. That is to say, I'm not going to augment any of this gear. If it has a power amp, it will have it. If it doesn't, it's not going to. And that means that there's probably room on the table for everything you're going to hear to only improve, especially because, once again, I'm not using anything in front of these amps in terms of distortion, tube screamer, overdrives, anything like that. The only thing I allowed myself to do on the Katana, as well as by proxy on all the other gear, is increase the gain going in. So I did allow myself to use the clean boost pedal on the Katana, just giving it pure gain, and kind of the same thing with any of the other gear involved. There was no clipping diodes in front. There's no tone knobs. It's just simply, if I needed to give the amp some more juice, then I did that. And that ultimately returns to the same point that all of these amps could potentially sound better if you spent more time sculpting each individual frequency going in and out of these things. But the point here really is to see how this stacks up in terms of a raw amplifier sound, to kind of see if we can either hear some cracks in the modeling scheme, or maybe it really holds its own against a premium amp modeling solution and even the real tube counterparts. So we have a number of other competitors, 4 others to be precise, and let's take a blind listen to this amplifier in context, see if you can predict which one the Katana is, if you can figure out what the other amplifier or amplifier sims are. And if you don't even want to do that, you could just maybe rank them by choice in terms of what you thought sounded best for each of the demonstrations. With that, let's take a listen. Before I reveal the other contestants, let's talk a little bit about how the Boss Katana was set up for this particular demonstration or set of demonstrations, as it's a little different from how I had it set up for the Gear Curiosities, to make it more of a one-to-one comparison and to give as many strengths to this platform as I could, because normally I'd kind of spill the beans ahead of time of saying, well, if it was a tube amp, it was going through this thing and I may have done that. Or if it's VST plugin, I'm accompanying it with this plugin. And I kind of wanted to leave this a little bit intentionally vague. That way you weren't listening for a specific hallmark trait to one of those setups. And one of those things I wanted to kind of keep a little bit on the down low until now is that the bloom switch was turned on for all of the amplifiers. And this was a setting that, we explored in the Gear Curiosities, which is apparently exclusive to the 3rd generation of heads and combos. And in every instance that I used it, I liked it better than when that thing was turned off. So I thought, okay, I think we should keep that bloom setting on, kind of give it a little bit of a more spongy and reactive power amp sound. But the problem I ran into is that you have basically 2 extremes when it comes to recording this at line level. You either have a cabinet simulation on at all times if you're recording through USB or the stereo headphone output, which is nice to have, but it's something I would have liked to disable, obviously, to use cabinet impulse responses. And then on the other hand, on the line out, if you have it to where the cabinet sound is disabled by using the stereo expand switch, you actually lose the bloom functionality because the bloom sound is apparently in the power amp. Now, whether that's completely digital inputs and outputs, I don't know that for certain. What I do know is that it probably shouldn't have to be, considering that they're doing some type of line level tap off of the headphones and other stuff. So I can't say I fully understand why they're segregating that switch to that particular block of the amplifier, but for whatever reason, that means that in order to get the bloom sound and a dry amplifier sound simultaneously, I had to record out of the speaker output of this thing. So I had to go through a load box. Now, because this is kind of a solid state Class D thing, it's going to have basically absolutely no influence. And I think it's really important to point this out because I feel a lot of people are going to pick this thing up and think, oh, this is awesome. I have something I can play out loud in the room. I can kind of grow with it and get a better speaker cabinet later, and I can even record dead silent direct. And that's great, but the problem is you can't really grow that much with the direct side of things because you are stuck with the onboard cab modeling, which is fine. It sounds good enough, I think, in a lot of instances. But if you have a bunch of cab IRs, you want a specific cab sound, well, you're losing another really cool function on here. I don't think it's the end of the world, but I do think bloom is quite a decent improvement. Again, it's not like worth $50 if you're looking between Gen 3 versus Gen 2, especially not worth like $100 to me, but if you can get them around the same price anyway, it is something to consider. So that's something that's frustrating and seems artificially limited. On the opposite side of the spectrum, you certainly pay a premium to be free of those limitations on the Fractal Audio FM9. Maybe to the detriment of new users, you might be overwhelmed there. But I used a number of amplifier models that I felt lined up with the amp sounds that I dialed in on the Boss Katana. I did reference this throughout, kind of each piece of gear. I chose amps that I thought fit the best kind of representative of that distortion texture or that overdrive texture. And I used the EQ controls that are on board, kind of the authentic controls, and again, gave it gain boost in front if I needed some clean boost. But beyond that, I didn't touch anything else. I'm not going to stick graphic EQ in the loop if it doesn't already exist on that amp and, try to tweak every frequency to make it sit exactly like this does, because I do kind of want to show, any limitations or, any fake hi-fi accents that might exist on this platform that don't exist on kind of those amplifier platforms that this is sort of representing. So you'll see all kinds of tones represented there, like a Bogner Ecstasy, a 2nd generation rectifier, a 5153, and all kinds of stuff that, again, I don't necessarily think I got 100% representative of this amp in terms of what the closest thing is on the FM9, but I think it should still give you a really good representation of kind of the core tones that we all go for a lot of the times. Following that, I have some real tube and iron with the Mesa Boogie Mark IV. Now, I could have just as easily have used the onboard FM9 Mark IV models because they are dead on, but what I kind of wanted to represent here is that there's a good chance that someone has picked up a tube amplifier and maybe it's as capable as this thing in terms of pre-distortion and post-distortion EQ, especially if you throw some pedals at it. And kind of wanted to show, well, given the same platform, just how different can you make it sound? And for those of you that are familiar with the Mark series, you'll probably know it's very capable. You just can't do everything when it comes to the capturing of particular distortion overtones or even some of the oddball preamplifier tones among Mesa Boogie's other offerings. After that, we have, you guessed it, it's the Pod Pro. Had to include this thing. If nothing else, just kind of as a sanity check to see how far has budget amplifier modeling come. And of course, back then, this thing was hardly budget, but being able to pick them up for about half the price or less of the Boss Katana, it is, I think, still a good benchmark to see, you know, for your dollar, how good of a sound are you getting and what kind of variety of sounds are you getting? Because on paper, at least, the Pod Pro has more amp models than this thing, but it also lacks power amp modeling. It lacks power amp at all. And the cabinet modeling is, you know, fairly rudimentary by today's standards. So obviously there's plenty of more budget gear out there to be compared to, especially the contemporary variety. And that was not my intention to, you know, shoot out the Katana with every budget-friendly Line 6 and Zoom and, you know, all the solutions out there, because I'm really not particularly interested in that concept. Other people have done it. What I want to see here is, can the professional things from 25 years ago keep up with the budget-friendly things of today? And with that theme in mind, that brings us to the last competing amp or amps in this free VST plugin collection. Longtime viewers of this channel will undoubtedly recognize some of these familiar faces like Lecto and X50, as well as Nalex's Amplex and the JCM 800 preamp from Mercurial. And all of these are, once again, something that you can pick up for free. I'm sure there's updated versions of most of these, as this is simply the versions of these plugins I've had for, you know, better part of 8 to 10 years now. But it goes to show that if you're going, you know what you want, if you're going after a particular amplifier tone, there's a very good chance that it exists for free out there. And it may not be the most up-to-date modeling. It may not be 100% accurate to the amp. But again, if you have a really quality collection of impulse responses, the amplifier is probably not going to be, you know, the thing that's holding you back. Once again, though, I say free, and it is technically free, but it does involve having other things to be able to play it to begin with, like an audio interface, like some type of monitoring solution, and things that you may not necessarily need with the Boss Katana. So you do have to weigh those costs, but what I wanted to evaluate here is if you wanted to spend $0 on the amp modeling side, can you be competitive with the Boss Katana or even exceed it in terms of tonal quality? So that's our contestants, and let's reveal who was who, which was which. While reamping 6 different tracks 5 separate times each was not exactly the most enjoyable use of time for me, I'm glad I did it because some of these results were rather surprising, some of them not so much. But I think having that spectrum of amplifier tone and especially distortion quality really shows how competent this is in many areas and where some of the things fall short. But even where I think it falls short in terms of accuracy, I don't necessarily think it falls short in terms of sounding fine and even really good sometimes. What I did notice is on the lower side of the gain spectrum, some of those crunch tones, for instance, it is remarkable how well old amplifier modeling tech holds up. And I feel like this is probably where a lot of those algorithms were developed from Line 6 and from a lot of the freeware, where maybe the most accurate tube tech and modeling algorithm isn't really necessary to get kind of that edge of breakup and an initial crunch tone. And maybe some of those non-linearities that aren't captured don't really matter because to my ears, this thing and the Pod Pro and even the Mercurial freeware basically sounded identical and sounded great. And in fact, I think maybe to a radio-friendly type of user's ears, it might sound more ready and more authentic to what people want out of a Plexi than the FM9 did with a Plexi model. Now, of course, you massage the controls a little more, pick a different model altogether, and you'll get there. But even still, I think some of these lower gain models still show how much hi-fi frequency content is present on this amplifier in general, no matter what mode you're on, where it doesn't even really matter how high the presence or treble is. You can kind of leave things all towards noon, and you're going to get a really, I don't know that you necessarily call it mix ready, but certainly a more processed and big tone than you might get out of a more traditionally filtered tube amplifier. And to a lot of people's ears, especially through headphones that might be lacking some of those frequency responses, then it's going to sound better because it is fuller. Now, I think this starts to fall apart a little bit on the higher gain side of things because especially on like something like the lead 2 mode, I know they're going for kind of a squishier rectifier sound, and it doesn't do a bad job. The problem is when you compare it to a what I feel is a more accurate free VST plugin, and especially the fractal stuff, you hear that you don't necessarily have all the same type of dynamic resonance. It's not really reacting to, palm mutes the same way, and some of that fizz is just ever present. Now, it's not the same type of fizz that you would hear out of an outdated amp modeler like the Pod. It doesn't have that ever-present, like, squishy stuff where it sounds like they've kind of took that crunch tube amplifier algorithm and just put 5 of them in, gain stages, and it falls apart. It sounds, really fake at that point. It can still sound cool, but it sounds fake. What this doesn't do quite so well, though, compared to its real tube counterparts or better modeling, is that there's almost like a transistor amp pick attack. And again, it doesn't sound bad, but it sounds, for lack of a better word, cold. Like it's missing some harmonic overtones. Like no matter what you do, there's not enough mids. And I don't say it's not enough mids musically. Like it sounds good, but again, without going to extreme potentiometer settings, everything is just kind of high fidelityized, for a lack of a better term. And again, that's one of those things that probably, depending on what CAD models you're using and what you're playing out in the room, it's going to sound more finished. It may not need as much post-production if you put it in a mix. But you can definitely see on some of the competing gear I used, I had to use kind of extreme EQ settings to get it to fall more in line with the Katana. And something like the 5150 kind of supposed to do that, ready out of the box at all noon thing, with the whole frequency spectrum kind of being perfectly balanced for most contemporary guitar tones using typical speakers. And this thing just really isn't on the Brown 1 and Brown 2, even with Bloom engaged. And you could use contour and stuff to try to make up for that. And I know they're not necessarily going for a specific version of the 6505 or 5150, but still, to get in that broad range, you're going to have to dial in the controls a lot more than just noon if you want to match it to the amp specifically. Going back to the more expensive gear for a moment, I am never not impressed by the Mesa Boogie Mark series for being so variable in terms of what you can dial in and how close you can get to other amplifiers. There are certain use cases where it simply cannot do what other amps are doing because despite the super powerful pre and post distortion controls on it, you simply can't always get that same type of texture and harmonics that are present in certain amplifiers. You know, you're not going to make a Mark series sound like a rectifier. It is that simple. You can make it sound pretty damn close to a Plexine JCM 800, and by extension, pretty close into the 6505 plus territory. Not necessarily at 5153 though. But if you, for some reason, are already starting off with a super capable tube amp like this, you're not necessarily going to feel that left out by not being able to get the brown sound perfectly, because this thing doesn't even do that. But who's really starting with a, $2,000-$3,000 tube amplifier these days? And because of that, I feel like, at least on the texture side of things, while it may not be as correct, this thing's going to edge it out for most people when it comes to bang for their buck. Again, I think a Mark IV on the lower gain side sounds more similar to the reference, tube amplifier we're trying to copy, but for variation, it's still hard to beat when it comes to comparing dollars to dollars. So yeah, it's still an impressive amplifier circuit, and I think there's a lot of amps out there that probably would, be well within this kind of range of capability for people. But when it comes to the pure variation of it, I think Boss still has an edge. Ignoring all the other peripherals you need to make this work, that calculation kind of goes to infinity when you start factoring in free VST plugins. And this one made this shootout extremely interesting for me, because there are some versions of those amplifier tones that I think just outright sounds better than the Katana. Not even more accurate. Just forget about the accuracy thing for a moment. I just thought they sounded better. Like the Amplex Friedman emulation or the Mark I preamp on the X50 for the Brown 1 comparison. I just would have rather used those instead of what was on board here. In fact, if it had some alternate version where you could load free VST plugins or some type of, neural amp modeler simulation onto this thing, I would overwrite that model with those type of emulations. I just think they sounded better because they still had the hi-fi, harmonics, the tube crunch, the palm mute reactivity that you want out of a good modeler, and it didn't have all the extra junk or the high-end fizz that never really goes away. So I think if you're hell-bent on a very particular amp model, you're going to be way happier surfing the web for a while, watching some tutorials, listening to some reviews, and finding that perfect emulation, even if you got to spend 20 to 50 bucks for it, because that's really what a lot of these things are going to come in at if you're not going for some of these brands that have lost their mind with marketing. And even if you're not going for a particular amplifier tone, there's a lot of freeware and stuff with low cost of entry that gets really good sounds, just like the Katana does, without shooting for a specific amplifier. So if you're just at the stage where you want to be part of the home recording crowd, the amp models alone on this thing aren't going to make up for it. Totally different conversation if we're talking about amps plus effects and you don't want to deal with any other outboard effects, or you really like Boss's stuff specifically. You don't get all of Boss's stuff, but still you get quite a bit of it. But when it comes to the amplifier modeling selection alone, it leaves the Katana at a very interesting crossroads, because even Boss themselves have better modeling tech in the GT series. And I think they go for this because it's cheaper, it's proven, and at this cost point, it kind of still makes a little bit of sense. But it is kind of strange in retrospect that they still sell this platform that hasn't upgraded to the, the Air D technology. And it's kind of also strange that you can take something that is physical like this, costs in the $300 to $400 range, and it can still be beat out by free VST plugins in terms of accuracy to a particular amp sound, or at the very least, what I think a tube amplifier of that variety should sound like. But if you're just going at this from amplifier sound, you don't care if it sounds like a tube amp, it can sound like a solid state amp, it can sound like a completely digital thing to you, and you don't give a shit, then, it can still have its value. What I can say definitively is that if you're going to use this for more than just an at-home recording device, you're hard pressed to go wrong with it. How many other ways can you put together a platform that has this many amps and effects and a power amplifier out and the ability to expand into a second one if you want, and the ability to record over USB? it's a pretty slick package. However, if you're an amplifier tone nut and you're just looking for a simple solution to get, say, a decent 5150 sound that you're able to play out in the room or out on stage or jam with your buddies and record it at home, there's a lot of different ways to get a more accurate sound, and probably a cheaper way if you're just looking for one single one. And I think maybe that's the most disappointing thing for me about the Katana. There's no killer amp model for me. They're all fine and they all sound pretty decent. Like, again, I didn't hate any particular tone, but putting them up next to some of the amplifier tones that I was going after during that shootout, I thought, man, that FM9 5153 sounds awesome. And I'm not even, a huge fanboy of the 5153. I love how Lecto sounds, and it needs a little bit of sculpting and, some help in front with something like a tube screamer more than a clean boost. But damn, what a great rectifier sim that is. Even Amplex, those simulations sound awesome. I just cannot point to a single model on the Katana, though, where I'm just stoked to play through it. Again, they're all okay, but they all have something I just don't really get inspired by. So I think maybe that's more disappointing than anything for me, because as terrible as some of the Pod Pro amp model sound, there's a couple that are just irreplaceable for me and capture just this moment in time that I absolutely love. I don't think anyone's going to look back on the Katana for that. I think they're going to look at it as a great value, as a kind of a champion of the people, but not any one particular tone off of it is going to be that memorable, because I've kind of already forgotten about it. So with that, any other questions or comments, please leave them down below. I hope this was useful in terms of, trying to make a decision about the Katana series if you're looking at it. And if you have given up on that premise, there's plenty of other options out there too that are probably more accurate, and, play with some freeware. This is always a good endorsement for that. We'll catch you next time. Bye.